evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. New information we are just getting in about the crash of an airliner flown by millions of people every day all around the world. Information that could shed light on the crash today of Germanwings 9525. As you probably know, it went down in the French Alps on a flight from Barcelona to Dusseldorf, Germany, with 150 men, women, and several children on board. Wreckage of the Airbus A320, thousands of small pieces of it scattered across the mountainside. Now, the plane descending 27,000 feet in nearly 8 minutes and apparently flying straight into the ground. Now, tonight, there's new focus on a key safety feature on Airbuses that can sometimes, under rare conditions, put them into a descent that can be hard to stop. Airbus knew of the problem, and in fact, the European Aviation Safety Agency, the equivalent of America's FAA, issued a warning about it nearly 4 months ago. Renee Marsh has been working her sources on this. She joins us momentarily, but first, how this tragedy unfolded. 10:01 a.m. local time, Germanwings flight 9525 takes off from Barcelona after a 26-minute delay. The plane, bound for Dusseldorf, Germany, immediately flies out to sea over the Mediterranean and starts to climb. Around 10:27, it hits its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. But just about 3 minutes later, right around the time flight 9525 is back over land in France, something goes wrong. It starts to lose altitude very quickly. In the span of about 8 minutes, it drops nearly 27,000 feet to 11,400 feet. It's now deep into the French Alps.
You just don't descend. As a pilot, you have to request the descent. You have to request to change altitudes. And since we know they didn't do that because air traffic control did not know and had not communicated with them. If they were talking to air traffic control, they could have told them about any problem they had on board. So whatever caused this caused the pilots to be unable to communicate or have no time to communicate.
As the plane goes further into the mountains, it continues to lose altitude. At 10:53, Germanwings flight 9525 crashes in the French Alps. 150 people are on board, 144 passengers, including 2 infants, and 6 crew members. The crash site is extremely remote. Those first on the scene described the plane as obliterated, the largest pieces of wreckage no bigger than a small car. The chance anyone survived, slim. I'm concerned with the depth of suffering that's being brought to so many people, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says. My thoughts are with those people who have lost somebody. We'll do everything to get the help that they need in these difficult hours. Nearly half of those on board were German, including 16 students from the same high school. A vigil started earlier in the day by fellow students grows as night falls, the hope that any of their classmates survived fading. And at the crash site, one of 2 black boxes is found. Hundreds continue to work on both the recovery effort and to try and figure out exactly what happened to Flight 9525. Well, we want to focus now more on that piece of Airbus safety technology. It can sometimes turn dangerous. It uses a pair of sensors to figure out if the plane's nose is pointing too high for the plane to keep flying, then steps in automatically to force the nose back down. Now, the problem occurs when something goes wrong with those sensors. The result obviously could be terrifying. Aviation correspondent Renee Marsh joins us now with more. So you're learning about this safety alert regarding the type of plane. What's the latest?
Well, I can tell you, Anderson, just for context, we know that these airworthiness directives, they are relatively common. Many are oftentimes issued for an aircraft, so that alone isn't a red flag. But in the absence of knowing exactly what went wrong on board this Airbus A320, we started looking into the background, possible problems that we've seen in the past. So this is the actual document. This is the airworthiness directive, and it was issued by the European Aviation Safety Association, administration. So we know that their concern, according to this document, stems from an A321, which that is in the same family as the A320. It's just slightly larger. The problem was that there were 2 what's called an angle of attack probes on the airplane. Essentially, what these 2 probes do is measure the angle of the plane to the horizon. If those 2 pieces of equipment are not functioning properly, you could have a situation where the pilot is getting the wrong indications inside of the cockpit. And based on that wrong information, the pilot is then entering his or her commands, but again, that's based on wrong information, and you have a situation where this plane could go out of control. So that is something that is being looked at. That was brought up in the press conference today, and the CEO of the airline did make reference that all of the software updates and maintenance has been completed on this particular aircraft.
What about the history of this kind of a plane?
Well, we know this specific aircraft is about 24 years old, so it is an older aircraft. That's being said, it's not something that when you look at it, you say, look, this plane should not have been flying. Yes, it's an older aircraft that had many hours on it, but still, many aircraft out there are still flying at this age. So we don't believe at this point age will be an issue. We also know that it underwent a maintenance check just yesterday, and it underwent a larger maintenance check in 2013. So it really just makes this mystery even deeper because you know that it had been looked at by these engineers just the day before Anderson.
All right, Renee, I appreciate it. Joining us now is our panel of aviation experts, aviation correspondent Richard Quest, veteran airline captain and CNN aviation analyst Les Abend, former NTSB chair Deborah Hersman, and CNN safety analyst David Susi, former FAA accident investigator and author of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, Why It Disappeared and Why It's Only a Matter of Time Before This Happens Again. Richard, what at this point makes sense to you in all this?
Very little, because the nature of what the plane was doing, it was in the cruise, the safest part of the flight. It was flying in extremely sophisticated airspace under Euro control, and it was a first-class airline, a first-world airline, German wings, owned by Lufthansa, and to Renee's point, maintained under the auspices of Lufthansa Technik, which is the industry standard.
So there's no difference between German wings and Lufthansa in terms of maintenance of the planes?
German wings has been a child of Lufthansa, going backwards and forwards between it for years. It's now a crucially important part of Lufthansa. So no, it's Lufthansa's group full through and through.
Les, to you, does anything make sense about, I mean, what possible explanation is there for this?
There's a lot of disturbing things to me. The lack of communication. Richard and I were talking about that during just prior to we got on air. You know, what I would like to know is what the communication was like all the way up to the point that we had our last contact with the aircraft. That's not being talked about at this point in time, probably because that information isn't quite available for the public. But that being said, something caused this airplane to come out to leave cruise altitude, and I have a feeling, my gut says the crew was compelled because of an emergency situation. What that emergency situation was, I don't know. It wasn't fast enough to do an emergency descent, which you would find in an explosive depressurization, which you would know right away.
That's the thing. I mean, this was an 8-minute descent. It's not exactly plummeting or anything like that.
And this is a descent rate that may be a little bit steeper than normal, but not really a whole lot. I've done this rate of descent on a normal approach or normal descent rate into Heathrow, coming out of the top of descent point from altitude. So this was nothing abnormal about it. We're pure speculation when we get to this point with the angle of attack indicators that Renee Marsh was talking about. I mean, we don't even know if these were a factor in it. Now, that's a scary factor, but we don't even know if that was part of it.
A factor. So let's not put too much emphasis on that, certainly
not at this point. Not at this point in time.
Deborah, if it was some sort of mechanical issue, I mean, one of the biggest questions is whether it was a problem specific to this aircraft or to this fleet, to the A320 fleet in general.
That's right, and investigators are going to be looking very closely at that. One of the reasons why they really want to get those recorders as fast as possible is because they're trying to figure out if there's an airworthiness issue, not just for this specific airplane, but for the fleet. If there are larger implications, if there are inspections that need to take place, or if there's any additional information that operators need to have.
David, when you look at the debris field, I mean, the lack of fire, the lack of smoke, and I don't know if that's just because the pictures are old, but does it tell you anything?
Well, it does tell me that it was a singular point of primary impact. It appears to be two scatter points, meaning that the aircraft did kind of skim or break apart just before it hit its main scatter point. But at this point, this type of accident, what's happening in this realm is that the aircraft not only explodes as it hits the ground, but it kicks back. There's a kickback effect, and those debris pieces that are coming back are intersecting and colliding with the aircraft that's still going forward. Now, this all happens within a matter of less than a second, but it all happens together, and that's why you see these horribly shattered pieces of aircraft debris. The good side of this is the fact that the passengers on board would have had no idea, no clue what was coming, other than they knew that they were descending. They may or may not have known from a cabin announcement whether to prepare for impact or not. But the only good side of this is that it happened in less than a second, certainly not ability to recognize what was actually happening to them on board.
But David, you're saying that not only is the plane, so the plane, as it impacts the ground, breaks apart, but also those pieces that, as it moves forward, the pieces that have broken off then bounce back and hit the aircraft?
Right, it's kind of a splashback effect. If you can imagine something hitting real solid, it kicks back from that. It almost makes a reverse push backwards. So most of the investigations I've done in this type of terrain, most of the debris field is backwards from the direction it was going in the first place. So those pieces that hit the ground come back at the rest of the remaining part of the aircraft and intersect and actually have these collisions, massive collisions as they're bouncing back, and the back of the aircraft still coming forward. So this happens so instantaneously, and people always ask me, why is there so many little tiny pieces? Well, it's because it's literally bouncing back and colliding with itself, and that's what creates this massive debris field and explosion.
And David, just in terms of a debris field like this on a mountain slope, it's got to be incredibly difficult to work this kind of a crash site.
It's very similar to an air crash I worked up in Casper, Wyoming, and it was snowing then. We had snow, we had debris, we had everything on the ground. We couldn't actually find the accident. We found a spot where we suspected it had hit, and I was dropped off in a helicopter there because there was no place to land. There was some search and rescue coming up in snowcats. They won't have that advantage here. They can't take snowcats or snowmobiles up to the area because it's already muddy and it's already difficult to get to. So that's going to be tough. That night in Casper, because of that terrain and investigating, we were able to find it during the snow, but the helicopters couldn't come back and get us. So the search and rescue team and I stayed the night there to make sure that we saw what we could, but there was no way to get out of there. And so that's one of the things here I'm glad about, is that they stopped this quickly.
We're going to have
just
more.
got those investigators out of there right away.
Yeah, we're going to have more on this. We've got to take a quick break. We're going to continue the conversation throughout the hour and check in with our Nick Robertson, who's at a staging area high in the Alps. We'll also look closer at what might have been going on inside that cockpit today and explore some other theories as the crash investigation gets underway.